What if she's a mother with children?
I think there are other forms of behavior. Let's take a woman who drinks alcohol while she's pregnant. Would you want to punish her criminally for drinking alcohol? We know that alcohol consumed in more than tiny quantities by pregnant women can have a deleterious effect upon children. Do we want to criminalize that behavior, or do we want to educate her, try to persuade her not to engage in behavior that causes that kind of harm? Is it advantageous to us to have that woman in prison because she has consumed alcohol while she is pregnant? I'm not, so far as I know, there is not evidence that smoking marijuana does more damage than drinking alcohol while a woman is pregnant.
Well, but you've reframed the question. You've made the baby in utero. I'm making I'm supposing that we have a mother with children out of utero, and for whom the alcohol or drug use leads to abuse and neglect. Then
I think one deals with it from the standpoint of abuse and neglect. That is, what is the form of abuse? Is it the consumption per se, or is it some other behavior that is the abusive behavior? I don't care what the abusive behavior comes from, whether it comes from some neurosis or whether it comes from the consumption of a drug, but if there is abusive behavior, you treat it according to the behavior.
Okay. Yes, sir.
On the question, I always take issue with the term victimless crime because it's a loaded term, and it assumes that the only basis for a crime is that it has a victim. So, you know, as a principle, I reject that. But having recognized that the law can be a moral teacher, especially at the local level, it largely comes down to a cost-benefit analysis, and this goes back to Manny's question. I didn't get a chance to answer, but I wouldn't have answered the question, are the costs worth it or not? There's a certain cost to a certain point that it's worth it. My main complaint here has been the over-enforcement of things to way going overboard in terms of, quote, the war. Because what happens? At a certain point, people say the costs are way too much. In our state, which was one of the first to put people away for very long times, and the drug DEA and the others, they would run the cases through the state instead of the feds because we had much longer sentences. All of a sudden, the conservatives in the legislature have realized we're going bankrupt and we can't do this. Well, that opens up the argument then to go the other way and legalize it or to non-enforce it. It seems to me that enforcement is appropriate to a certain point, even if there isn't, quote, a victim. To put it another way, what if we had a society where 50% were dope heads? I mean, what kind of a society is that? Is that meaning that there's no victim? I mean, we are socially connected.
Yes, sir, you've been very patient.
Thanks. I think partly the traction that this decriminalization issue has gained is in part of a couple of different factors, and this is just to frame this question. And one is that there are some drug crimes that have been overpunished with too long of sentences, or often there's not a federal nexus for the punishment that's been inflicted on some of the people who are gone after by the feds. I think the other one is that a lot of the current generation doesn't recognize the destructive effect that was happening throughout America in the 60s and 70s. So there's sort of a loss of memory about how this affected people in middle class America, et cetera. And many of the affected communities have a very different view, even today, about whether drugs should be decriminalized. With that said, there's a fair amount of research that shows that criminalization itself is one of the major deterrents to children first using drugs, and also that those who use drugs are over a dozen times more likely to engage in child abuse. Thinking about the principles here, right now we've got a bill that's gone through that basically criminalizes, and I'm talking to Mr. Neier. I really appreciate John Baker's approach about federalism, and Mr. Cuéllar about the things that have worked, because I think we've broken up some drug cartels in this nation. So one of the reasons we're focused on is Mexico, because they're operating there instead of here. What about criminalization in general? If you think that that is not something that should be applied to those who use drugs, what about health care? Right now there's health care. Right now there's in H.R. 3962, there is a criminal provision that would penalize those who fail to meet the government mandates on health insurance. So if I don't insure my family according to the government-approved plans, there would be a penalty of up to 5 years in prison for that if it's deemed to be a willful felony. 1 year if it's just a misdemeanor. Is that the type of use of criminal law? Are you in favor of criminal penalties for?
I'm not in favor of that use of criminal law.
And so what's the distinction? How do you make this distinction? Do you think there's there's indication there's victims here in the drug enforcement context? What's the distinction that you're making the difference on?
I'm not making a distinction. I'm saying that I would not criminalize those who fail to get insurance or something like that, and I would not criminalize those who possess marijuana for their own use. Both of those seem to me forms of conduct which do not injure other people, and I think the criminal law should be reserved for conduct that injures others.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes. Mr. Walters mentioned alcohol prohibition, and we saw with alcohol prohibition that you had a criminalized market, and the externalities of criminalizing that market were the rise of Al Capone, organized crime, violence in the streets, whereas before people weren't dying from overdoses of alcohol because it was a regulated market. Under prohibition, you had people dying from bathtub gin, etc., moonshine, what have you. So in our conversation today, we're talking about the prohibition of other illicit drugs, and I'm wondering, so we call these controlled substances, and it seems to me it's somewhat of an Orwellian misnomer, because as soon as we say they're controlled substances, we're actually taking them out of the control of normal markets, normal regulation, government oversight, and we're placing both the regulation of that market into the hands of criminals as well as the profits. And so we haven't talked about the profits and to both the drug dealers inside the United States as well as the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan or other drug dealers in the Andean region or Southeast Asia. So I'm wondering, at what point do those externalities begin to trump whatever sort of benefit, morally or otherwise, you're claiming we're getting from the criminalization of the drugs?
I'm not sure I entirely follow that question, but let me see.
Can you let me see if I can refocus. Are you asking whether the prohibition is creating transaction costs that are so great that some alternative to prohibition should be considered? Did I accurately if I didn't translate it right, I want you to do it in a sentence or sit down.
Do the costs of criminalizing drugs and the economic externalities in doing so outweigh the benefits of criminalization?
All right.
Okay. I think that we've had that question a number of times, so let me try one more time to give you an answer. One, using the prohibition example. Organized crime did not come into existence during Prohibition, and it didn't end at the end of Prohibition. In fact, as some of you are old enough to remember, Bobby Kennedy was working at the Justice Department doing strike forces well after Prohibition ended. What it did do is gave some organized crime groups more money, as it is in Mexico, but they will exist, and they do exist, from extortion, car theft, prostitution, and a whole range of other activities. Can we cut off this area of resources? Well, we can. We have changed the availability of a number of drugs to the better. And when we do, both demand and supply, I referred to meth, I referred to cocaine, I could refer to other things like ecstasy, where enforcement and education work together. Where they work together, you can get quite dramatic changes. We had this happen also with LSD. There's some material, I won't go into it now.